What I am going to present to you today is in some ways technical, but the understanding which I want to share with you revolutionized my entire perspective in ethics. Hence, for me at least, it gave rise to a paradigm shift. My hope is that the same will be true for at least some of you who watch this. To start off with, we should be clear about the problem which motivates this talk. This is variously called Hume's dilemma and the is-ought dichotomy. Hume's dilemma amounts to the realization that it seems that ethical statements along the lines of one ought to do X or one ought not to do Y can only ever be justified in terms of other ethical statements of a similar form. And so it would seem that ethics suffers from an infinite regress problem, elephants standing on turtles, standing on pigs, and so on. If this is the case, then it would seem that ethics is pretty much a delusion, as it is impossible to explain what one means by ought and value, or good and evil, in anything other than equivalent terms, which strongly suggests that these ideas are vacuous. As Voldemort puts it, there is no such thing as good and evil, Harry Potter, but only power, and those who are afraid to exercise it. In classical terms, this amounts to the idea that might is right. In other words, if I'm able to do something, then there is no reason why I should not do it. Nietzsche can be understood to mean this when he claims that will to power is the most basic motivator. Generally speaking, we tend to value a thing because it is useful in achieving a desired objective, and we think that we ought to do X because doing X will help us to attain some valuable end, outcome, or state of being. However, this way of thinking certainly results in an infinite regress, because one can always ask what is desirable about the objective in view, what makes it valuable, why is it of use. This will tend to result in an answer cast in terms of yet another purpose, and so on, and so forth. Moreover, it also instrumentalizes human beings. If people only have dignity, that is, are only worthwhile and valuable to the degree that they are useful, then out goes the idea of inalienable human rights, and in comes Huxley's brave new utilitarian world. Against this train of thought, I think it would be remarkable if the entirety of ethics was as insubstantial as this. It seems extravagant to dismiss all questions of morality, of right and wrong, good and evil, as merely delusional. It has always struck me as much more plausible that ethics has some kind of sound basis, and that it is possible to resolve Hume's dilemma somehow. You may object at this point that what might seem to be an infinite regress does not imply a vacuity of meaning. After all, it would seem inevitable that there are fundamental concepts which cannot be explained in terms of even more fundamental concepts. Perhaps one ought to do a certain thing simply because it is the right thing to do, and one cannot and ought not look further into this. In physics, there are a whole set of fundamental and seemingly irreducible concepts, in particular space-time, mass-energy momentum, electric charge, and quark color. At present, we have nothing to say when asked, for example, the question, what is electric charge? We can say a great deal about what electric charges do, what effect they have on each other, but nothing whatsoever about what they are, how they are constituted. However, it strikes me that the way in which the foundational concepts of physics are given and the role that they play in our understanding of the world is entirely different from any way that a fundamental and irreducible ethical principle could work. To say anything along the lines of, you should do X because that is right, would always invite the question, why? And if this question is not answered in a better way than, because I say so, one is effectively adopting a deontological ethic in which the arbitrary, whimsical, or tyrannical decree of some inscrutable parent figure deity is supposed to be the sole basis for ethics. Moreover, ethical oughts do not produce effects in the way that electric charges do. Electric charges can, in a sense, be understood in terms of their consistent effects, but the effect of ought can be as diverse as guilt feelings, social cohesion, heroism, mercy, suicide, war, and vengeance. Electric charge is determinative in accordance with Maxwell's equations, whereas the oughts of ethics are somehow only indicative. But indicative of what exactly? If one cannot explain why one ought to do X and why one ought not to do Y in terms of something other than another ought, then it seems apparent to me that ethics is either delusional or else an arbitrary game imposed on us by some whimsical deity, a possibility that I, for one, am not willing to countenance. Of course, one way out of Hume's dilemma would be to come up with an objective system of values. For if one could say that one ought to do X because this will obtain the objective benefit Z, then we are home and dry. If Z is known to be objectively good, excellent, or whatever, this answers our why question adequately. But all we've really done here is transform the infinite regression of oughts into a snark hunt for objective value. What can one mean by objective value, when it seems that anything of value only has value in as far as it facilitates some purpose, and a purpose is either undertaken to obtain something valuable, or else because one otherwise ought to strive to attain the end in view. If there is no objective value, then ethics is vacuous, because whatever value we perceive is nothing other than an insubstantial paper tiger. As Meatloaf complains in his song, I Want My Money Back, all of the things which we tend to subjectively value in our lives, family, friendship, love, sex, money, security, status, reputation, possession, skill, education, health, and so on, are broken. They amount to nothing in the last analysis, and deep down we know this to be true. Now, I want to switch to what I expect will seem an unrelated question, namely, what is the meaning of life? When people ask this in casual speech, they typically mean the Arthur Dent question, to which Douglas Adams had deep thought provide the definitive answer, 42. The issue with which this question tries to grapple is of fundamental significance, I would say. However, it is very difficult to formulate clearly, and it seems altogether impossible to answer. It tends to suffer from the same problem of infinite regress that bedevils ethics, in particular trying to find meaning in terms of any being other than oneself, a romantic partner, one's progeny or nation, or even God, is problematic, as the question then arises as to how that other being, even God, can substantiate meaning any better than oneself. If you can't find meaning, purpose, and significance in your own being, then why would you think it might be found in some other being? The question, what is the meaning of life, is ambiguous, however. It can also be understood as an apparently innocuous request for a definition or, as I prefer, an account of the idea lying behind the word life. I'm going to argue in the next part of this talk that giving a good answer to this technical question is key both to answering the Arthur Dent question and to resolving Hume's dilemma. So then, what is the meaning of life? You may object that it is not obvious that life has a simple meaning. Might it not be the case that life is some kind of portmanteau word that is used to gather together a group of related phenomena which nevertheless have no common underlying principle? There might be words like this. That is obvious. After all, what does the word game signify when snap, poker, snakes and ladders, chess, rugby, croquet, volleyball, and Dungeons and Dragons are all supposed to be games? I think that there are two sensible responses to this. The first response is to remark that either there is some rationale for gathering together seemingly disparate elements, or else there is not. On the one hand, if there is no such rationale, then the grouping is arbitrary, of no account, and should be dismissed as unworthy of consideration. Such a grouping simply cannot have any role in science or philosophy, though it may be of great importance in psychology, sociology, or any of the humanities, where conventional constructions abound, mostly to the great harm of those who uncritically accept them as substantial and valid. On the other hand, if there is such a rationale, however obscure it may be and how difficult to make explicit, then that is the underlying principle which unifies the matter. Hence, the archetypical example of a portmanteau collection is the set S of n sets, which each contain all but one element of the set A, which itself has n elements. Each element of S lacking a different element of A. The members of the set S have no single element in common, but all are very similar to each other. However, it is clear that the rationale for grouping them together is the intention to demonstrate what one might mean by a portmanteau set, and that this is the unifying principle which justifies their association as a set. In this case, the way to understand and account for the set S is not to be found within the set by looking for what is common to all its members, but by looking beyond the set to what motivates its construction, the transcendent principle which generates it, and which justifies grouping together its constituents, even though they do not have even a single element in common. The second response is to assert that as I am going to present an easy to understand account of the meaning of life, this issue is beside the point. If it is possible to explain what in fact one does mean by life, and to do so in a way that is clearly applicable without difficulty to any situation, then the possibility that life is a portmanteau concept, a social construct or linguistic convention is directly excluded. When I was studying O-level biology, we had O-levels before A-levels when I was at school, not GCSEs. I was told that life was characterized by growth, nutrition, excretion, respiration, reproduction, and movement. In other words, any living thing did all these things, whereas no non-living thing did so. Now, delineating any concept by such a list is profoundly unsatisfactory. It is more of a description than an explanation or account, and indicates a singular lack of understanding. Quite apart from the fact that some living things, such as mules, cannot reproduce, and some, such as the critters which thrive in close proximity to deep ocean volcanic plumes, can only be said to respire in a most obscure, abstract and remote sense of the word, what could we make, on this basis, of the kind of unfamiliar situation to which Mr. Spock responded with the conclusion, "It's life, Jim, but not as we know it"? I'd like you to reflect for a moment on the following scenario. You are in a remote part of the cosmos, in an environment very, very different from anything found on Earth. You encounter some phenomenon and have to decide whether or not it is a life form. How would you make such a decision? What is it you would look for? Is there a fundamental or constitutional characteristic or modality of existence which makes something to be alive? Please note, I am not talking about animal life, or sentient life, and certainly not conscious life. A bacterium is very much alive, and so is a mushroom. I want now to convince you that the meaning of life is pretty obvious. I came to this conclusion of my own initiative, but later found out that the great theoretical physicist Edward Schrödinger had proposed something recognizably identical many years previously. My proposal is that life is persistence of form arising from out of a flux. What do I mean by this? By persistence of form, I mean that there must be a recognizable shape, pattern, organization, or configuration which is stable over time. An oak tree drops its leaves each autumn and tends to extend its dimensions as it gets older, but there is much about it that identifiably stays the same, year in and year out. And at the deepest level, its genetic code is absolutely stable, of course. I accept that an acorn doesn't have much in common externally with an oak tree, but as soon as it germinates and grows its first two true leaves, it gains a distinct semblance with its mature form. A cabbage-white butterfly may start out as an egg, become a caterpillar, and then a chrysalis before reaching its adult form. But it is stable both as a caterpillar and as an adult. It is only subject to developmental change when it is an egg and a chrysalis. And even then, as with the germinating acorn, its genetic basis is absolutely stable. Moreover, the species oak tree as a whole certainly qualifies as living, because the developmental changes which each of its instantiations undergoes constitute part of the persistent patterning of the species as a whole. The same goes for the species cabbage-white butterfly, of course. Arguably, the developmental changes which characterize the infancy of a life form are a coming to be alive and a transition from a potentiality for being alive to an actuality of being alive. This is not to denigrate the infantile state as of less significance than the adult state, but rather to understand the significance of the infant as a potentiality for adulthood. When it comes to species which have very short adult lives, I'm thinking of mayflies and the like, then it makes more sense to understand the larval state as being most truly alive, and the mature state to be a passing phase characterized by as much by morbidity as by reproductive potency. By flux, I simply mean a flow of stuff. For animals, this stuff is material. Food is ingested and feces are expelled. For plants, this stuff is mostly energy. Visible light is absorbed and heat is dissipated. Carbon dioxide and water are also taken in and oxygen excreted, of course, but these facts are not the flux in which plant life sits and from which it emerges. This flow of matter is instigated by the plant's own activity. Unlike the flux of optical photons, it is not a pre-existent reality which the plant exploits. By arising out from, I mean simply that the flux is not incidental, but that it is precisely the fact that there is an input and an output, and hence a flow, which enables the form to persist. The form of non-living beings persists passively, by static opposition to change. This contrasts dramatically with the way in which the form of living beings persists, which is dynamic. Living beings are continually repairing or replacing damaged parts, fighting the entropic tendency to dissolution, not by rigidity, hardness and toughness, but by an active response to wear and tear. In effect, every living being can be understood as a nexus of dynamic stability, which actively maintains its recognizable self-identity by dumping the entropy which would otherwise disrupt its form into a flux within which it exists and by which it persists. The image occurs to me of a medieval village situated next to a river which it uses as a sewer and for general waste disposal. This account of life, which makes no mention of biology or even of organic chemistry, is universally applicable. It would apply just as much to a life form composed of knots of interacting plasma and magnetic field lines and residing in the outer layers of a star, as to one composed of vortices and shock waves and residing in the atmosphere of a gas giant planet like Jupiter. Indeed, I assert that the great red spot of Jupiter is indeed a kind of life form. It is a huge vortex which has persisted for many decades and certainly persists on the back of a flux. As with plant life, this flux is fundamentally cellular illumination, but in a secondary sense it is the general flow of atmosphere past the giant vortex. And the great red spot persists by systematically dumping entropy into the heat sink represented by Jupiter's general mass. Arguably, the simplest kind of life form we regularly encounter is the flame. Every flame has a stable form. and it maintains its existence by taking in fuel, tallow in the case of a candle flame, otherwise gas or oil of some kind, and excreting mostly carbon dioxide and water. Perhaps the underlying reason that many religions use candles, lamps or other kinds of sacred fires in their rituals is that there is a widespread intuition that flames do not merely symbolize life, but are in fact a simple life form. Life, understood in this way, is a phenomenon of non-linear physics. In a non-linear system, it is possible for certain patterns of behaviour to exist for which the tendency towards dissipation and decay, caused by friction-like effects, is exactly compensated for by the non-linear aspects of the equations governing the system. In such a case, the particular behaviour is stable, and persists for far longer than one might reasonably expect given the dissipation which is continuously undermining it. The resulting behaviours are called solitons. The simplest examples of such phenomena are shock waves, such as the Severn bore, a soliton shock wave which regularly passes up the River Severn far inland as a result of the tide rising in the Severn estuary. All such phenomena qualify as primitive life forms on my account of the matter. You may object that my explanation of life is too generic, and that it is extravagant to claim that every candle flame, the Severn bore, and Jupiter's great red spot are all living beings. But why is this so? I'm not arguing that any of these things have some magical or spiritual property. I'm not arguing that any of them are more than they seem to be. All that I'm arguing is that a proper understanding of life implies that they should be recognized as primitive life forms. Clearly, my account of the matter goes some way to answering the question, how can life arise from non-living matter? If there are very many merely physical and non-organic phenomena which are alive in a primitive sense, it is less difficult to conceive that in various times and places such phenomena may have been accidentally augmented in ways which enhance their persistence. Once it is conceived that such incremental enhancements might be possible, it is less difficult to conceive of a path between conventionally inanimate and conventionally animate things. For what once seemed like the problematic inanimate to animate transition is now perceived as trivial, and the main difficulties are seen to be in how the life form gains the abilities first to reproduce, and second to encode aspects of its own nature in some kind of internal blueprint. Note that reproduction is important not for a thing to be accounted as living, but for evolution to occur. The same goes for the possession of an internal blueprint, which is the most general way I can think of to refer to what we encounter as genetics in organic life. How does any of this help with Hume's dilemma, you may ask? Well, the next step in my argument is to note something which Ayn Rand points out. If the world, the whole universe, was devoid of life, then the concepts of value, purpose, good and evil would not arise, nor would they be in any way applicable. Things would just be what they were, and just do what they did. There would be no basis on which to evaluate anything or event. No process could be purposive, and no outcome could be either good or bad. History will be just one expletive-deleted thing after another, as the character Rudge says in Arnold Bennett's The History Boys. Rudge is himself misquoting the historian A.J. Toynbee. As soon as there is life, persistence arising from out of flux, then either life does persist, and so it is coherent and self-consistent, or else it does not. This is the fact which originates value, purpose, good, and evil. All these concepts are predicated upon the self-identity of life, and this is because of the necessity of flux, for life to be what it is, namely persistence arising from out of flux. The idea of value is underpinned, implied and explicated by the source of low entropy stuff which life is predicated upon, and which life forms actively seek out, because if they do not do so, they will cease to be what they are. what is of prime value is this low entropy stuff, and by extension any instrumental means by which it may be accessed or secured. All that is valuable is only valuable because it contributes, directly or indirectly, to the obtaining of low entropy stuff, or of other environmental conditions upon which life is predicated of necessity. I hope that by now you have realised that we have a commonplace name for low entropy stuff, and that this is food. The idea of good is simply that which facilitates or supports life. Food, warmth, shelter, friendship, technology, culture, knowledge, wealth, society, and so on. What is good is, of course, also valuable. Hence the word goods is a close synonym for the word valuables. The idea of evil is simply that which frustrates or undermines life. Poison, extremes of temperature, vulnerability, exposure, conflict, ignorance, poverty, disease, isolation, and similar. The idea of purpose arises directly from life. It is misguided to ask, what is the purpose of life? The question cannot be answered sensibly, and as we have seen, if an attempt is made to answer it anyhow, this will lead to an infinite regression. Contrariwise, it is correct to assert life has no purpose other than itself, and the foundational purpose, upon which all other purposes are built, is nothing other than the constitutional nature of life, which is persistence arising from out of flux. It is perhaps better to say that life has no value or purpose in itself, but is nevertheless the origin, source, and fountainhead of all value, worth, and purpose. On this account of things, the unspoken and non-negotiable purpose, which is the basic justification for every ought, is the existential fact of life. Only a living being can have a purpose, and the foundational, definitive, intrinsic, unavoidable, necessary, and singular purpose of any life form is simply to live, and so to persist. The instinct to survive is not accidental or extrinsically useful for life. It is an inevitable and necessary consequence of life being what life is for any living being capable of any degree of volition. The paradigm shift to which I referred at the start of my talk amounts to this. Instead of trying to understand the purpose of life and how value can have an objective basis in terms of informal or common sense notions of purpose and value, I now understand purpose and value in terms of how they arise directly from the fact of life. Given life, there is purpose and value, and this is beyond dispute. But life itself does not have a deeper purpose, and is not, properly speaking, valuable. This is not any denigration of life. It is merely a recognition that life is so crucial and significant that it automatically generates these realities. Life is sufficient for itself, and is in no need of any extrinsic justification. This, then, is the realization which answers Hume's dilemma, the bridge between existential statements and ethical statements, the philosopher's stone which transforms base metal to gold, is life. Life is an existent reality. It amounts to a contingent persistence of form. For life to be what it is, it must persist. If life does not persist, it is not itself. For life to persist, and so to have any integrity of being, to be self-consistent and ontologically coherent, certain things are necessary. And these necessities are nothing other than what ought to be the case. And as far as these things are actions on the part of the living organism, actions which it must do if it is to continue to be itself, then they are ethical demands upon it. If the organism chooses to act in accordance with what it ought to do, then it will live and continue to be itself and maintain its form. If it chooses to act in contradiction with what it ought to do, then it will cease to be itself. It will die and have no more choices to make. If my account of the matter is correct, the question then arises: if life is sufficient for itself and requires no purpose to justify it being what it is, then why do people seek for purpose in life? I believe the answer to this question is also apparent. Children do not bother themselves with this question. For a child, it is sufficient to be alive and to relish this fact. It is only adults, and especially adolescents, who dwell on such questions. The reason for this is obvious, and is pointed out by the science fiction author Robert Heinlein in his classic work, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. Adolescents and adults are cognizant of their own personal mortality. Putting the matter into a soundbite, one might say, the problem with life is death. If it wasn't for our personal mortality and our personal knowledge of our personal mortality, I think we would all be happy simply to be alive and would not seek for purpose or meaning beyond our lives. The motivation behind the question, what is the meaning of life, is a response to the seeming futility of all human achievement, as expressed in Shelley's poem Ozymandias, where the inscription beneath the fallen statue of the great king proclaims to the desolate sands, "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair," when of course there are no works to look upon. Hence, the real meaning of the Arthur Dent question is, what are we to make of death? And that is a subject for a different talk. I will finish and open the floor to questions and general discussion after one final quote from the biblical book of Deuteronomy, where God speaks to the Israelites not long after they have fled Egypt and have been given the law. The word is very near to you. It is in your mouth and in your heart, that you may do it. See, I have set before you this day life and good, and death and evil, that you may live and multiply. I call heaven and earth to record this day against you, that I have set before you life and death. Therefore, choose life, that both you and your progeny may live. Thank you for your attention.